not gonna be here tonight. And we'll also have to speak up because the microphone's not gonna work in the middle, and so the camera has to pick up our voice. So I'll let you, do the technical work.
Why don't we call the meeting to order and take roll?
Marevka? Here. Jones?
Here.
March? Parker?
Here.
Ham?
Here.
Bowden.
All right, as Amy mentioned, the mayor isn't here, and trustee March, who is the president pro tem, is not here, so we need a motion and a second to appoint somebody as temporary chair for the purposes of this meeting. Peter will be back for the main meeting, so it's not a lot of heavy lifting, hopefully. Does anyone?
Make a motion, we appoint Ken.
I second it.
Oh, man. You get your legs back and see what happens to you.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? You're welcome to vote against it if you want.
He's very well spoken.
All right, so turn it over to you.
Okay, well, let's see, your minutes are in the packet there. Any amendments or changes or comments? If not, a motion to accept the minutes as presented.
Motion. Second.
So, motion by trustee Jones and second by trustee Parker.
Jones?
Yes.
Parker?
Yes.
Ham?
Yes.
Marevka? Yes.
Next on the agenda are public comment. Anyone here for any non-agenda items? No? Okay. Next on the list here is proposed ice cream shop, candy shop on 209 North 2nd Street. I see the building here in our packet.
Yeah, so this is just a discussion for you. We just wanted to present this concept idea for you. And Ms. Avis is here. She owns this building that you see here on 2nd Street. And it's currently zoned B1. And she had come to me and talked to me about this idea. She's got some apartments on top, but then on bottom, she's thinking about possibly bringing an ice cream shop and a candy shop on the bottom. So since it's, and I included the zoning code in there for you guys to see, that is like word for word an allowable use of the in the zoning code. So, but she wanted just to come and talk to you and tell you a little bit about herself and about what she's proposing in this space for a new business in Peatone.
Thank you. I'm a little nervous, so, well, thank you for allowing me to come here tonight. And as Amy had said, that my idea is exciting for the village of Peatone. I know most people love ice cream and candy, and it'll bring a nice concept to the village of Peatone as well. My idea is to have ice cream with seating inside. It's about 850 square feet. There'll be candy, jar candy, some candy from around the world. I have a ton of retail experience. So I've ran districts, and I have a lot to bring to the village. So I just wanted to see if you have any questions for me with regards to the concept.
Will you be the operator actually working in the facility?
Yeah, I will initially to get the business off the ground. I have a lot of experience of hiring a team, and one of my strengths is to really develop people. So I do intend to hire local people to work in the south as well.
What hours would you keep?
That is open at this point. I haven't really delved into that. I'm at the beginning stages of it, but it would be probably 11 o'clock till 9 at night. I don't know for sure at this point.
Is it gonna be candy like behind a glass thing, or will it be kind of like the bins and barrels where people can scoop up at their own?
I'm going to work with an architect to see how we can plan it out. I'm actually meeting with him tomorrow to see how we can plan it out into the area. My idea is jarred candy like the old fashioned jarred candies, you come in and say, you know, I want some of that and some of that, and we would serve it to you. And that also, my vision is to have wrapped candy as well, so that there isn't a choice.
Will it be homemade candy or just candy bought elsewhere?
I won't personally be making any candy, not one of my strengths, but I do hope to connect with local candy makers and really small business owner to a small business owner. I think it would be really cool to have local candy in the shop.
How many square foot is the whole downstairs?
It's 3,000,
So you'll be using
850.
40%.
Yeah, it's already partitioned off when the units were built on the second floor. It's already partitioned off.
What are your projected costs on the total build out until we open the door?
Until I see the drawings, until I see that, and I can envision it and speak with electricians and plumbers, they do have a GC already. And this is true guesstimate, 50,000.
It's a pretty big investment.
That'd be personal funds, yeah. I believe the ice cream, I believe in ice cream, I believe in candy, and I think, you know, that so many times I've heard people say, I'm going to another village for ice cream tonight, and I just want people to say, I'm coming to Pieta. I really do, and yeah.
Is the ice cream a franchise or?
No, it won't be a franchise. I'm sourcing suppliers. I've looked at a couple already. And like I said, I'd like to find somebody that's been a small business and been successful that can supply it to the shop. I have ideas of like, you know, like parties, like kids' parties, not in the shop, but supplying like the little gifts that you give out at candy shop, the birthday parties and such.
Is there anything in that building on the first floor now?
Just storage,
Okay.
yeah, my stuff, basically.
You live here in town?
I don't, no,
Where do you live?
Tinley Park.
Are you the sole owner of the building?
Yes.
Sounds like a good idea.
I'm really excited about
I
it.
know, we need an ice cream shop.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you have a question for us, or what can we do to help you?
All I want is your support and to help me, you know, get the business through the planning stage. Like I said, I'm meeting with the architect tomorrow so that we can plan out the space. And yeah, go from there. I'm hoping if everything is lined up properly, I can get it open for next summer business. I want to be involved in all of the events that you have in Peatone as well. I think it'll be, especially with the weather that we've been having right now, it would have been phenomenal to have been open. So,
Have you ever had an ice cream candy shop before?
you know what, I haven't. My parents did years ago. Yeah, I just have, I think it just brings happiness to everybody, and it's an affordable item that would really bring, you know, joy to a lot of people.
How many people do you think you'll see?
That's a good question. There's a lot of people that walk around Peatone in the evening, so, and there's a lot of people that do come in to the bowling alley. There's a lot of people that do come into the village, so it's hard to say at this point how many I would see on a daily basis.
Kids would love it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Kids would love it.
and I'm open. Like I said, I've had a lot of retail experience in my life, and I'm always open to learning something new, and I think it's really important that you listen to others and listen to your customer base as well to find out, you know, what is it that they want, you know, and just having their ideas as well. I think it's important. I'm not a teenager anymore, so it's good to hear what they want.
I know at one time there was, where the old barber shop was.
Yeah.
On Second. That was an ice cream parlor at one time, and they did just a landslide business.
It was really cute.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They have a lot of vision and ideas that some work with the architect on how to set it up inside as well.
Question for Amy, like, I know it's premature, but there's no TIF funds available yet to help a business like this, right?
There's no funds in the TIF fund, but we can always work with her on a redevelopment agreement, and if she's putting the funds up front, she could be eligible for reimbursements
Okay.
once there's funds in the TIF.
Okay.
Sounds like something worth exploring.
Yeah,
Yes.
so if she's interested, I can send her a tip application.
Okay,
Okay. Excellent.
sounds good. Any more comments, questions?
I'll see you over
Sounds
there
great.
when
Thank you
it's
for
open.
coming.
But
I'm
Thank you,
looking forward to it.
thank you very much.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is the Cannabis Regulation Tax Act. I do see someone from Aqua, I don't know who wants to give a.
I'm just here for support.
Okay,
Just-
great.
I wanted to make a meeting every month, and
The cannabis tag was pretty thick, so I thought I might put you ahead of that.
if you don't need me, I was really just here to, in case you guys had any questions for anything.
I don't know, does anyone have any Aqua questions before we dive into the cannabis? No changes on timing as far as bringing water?
No.
Okay.
Anything happening in the village that we should know about?
No, I just kinda figured I might give a couple of questions on the main break that we had on Route 50, and I just wanna make sure we did a good enough job communicating. I know, when we get into residential situations, we're probably not as precise as we are when it comes to business. But I know we woke the mayor up a couple times in the middle of the night, and I just wanna make sure that we're hitting all the right buttons and the right people are getting notified.
What was the cause of the break?
Main break is a blowhole in the
Oh,
main.
okay.
So we're gonna wind up having to put another valve in at one point or another, but I think we did a good job of getting everything shut down and keeping all of the businesses in service, and that was really kind of what our goal was that night. So we know we've got a couple more things to do, a couple valve issues that we've gotta resolve, and we'll get that covered over time, but from my perspective, I just wanna make sure that we're doing a good enough job communicating on what's going on. Facebook and social media has a tendency to take over things at times.
Yeah.
So, again, in this situation, if it probably would have been just residential and not a big area, I probably would have never notified the mayor himself. But in this case, when it comes to business, we wanna make sure that the board and the mayor's right on top of things, so. Nobody likes that phone call that says, hey, I'm out of business, and the mayor goes, I don't even know what you're talking about. So,
Right.
that doesn't go over very well.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so that's really what my goal was, to make sure that we're doing what we need to do, and be here to support you guys any way we can.
I appreciate you coming and letting us know.
Thank you.
Well, thanks.
So I guess we'll move into the next item, is the adult use cannabis regulation and tax acts.
Yes. So as you guys remember, we talked about that last month, and everyone was interested in getting some additional resources and information, which we've tried to give you. So quite a bit of reading material. And in addition, I'm just gonna go over, again, I know I breezed through it last time, but I'm gonna give you another little overview on it through a quick PowerPoint here, so we have the lay of the land. So Illinois just became the 11th state to approve private use and consumption of recreational cannabis. There's a number of other states that allow medical cannabis, like we've done since 2014, but we're the 11th for recreational or adult use cannabis, as it's called in the act. And so after January 1st, adults over 21 will be able to legally use and possess cannabis for recreational use in Illinois. One of the things that the act does is delegate to local governments the ability to regulate the cannabis-related businesses within your jurisdiction. So that's kind of the focus of our discussion. We talked last time, there's dispensaries, there's cultivation centers, there are infusers and craft growers and transporting and processing organizations. So there's a number of different types of cannabis businesses that can be regulated. The currently authorized medical cannabis regulations within the state remain largely intact. We're going to talk a little bit later about some business distance regulations that are kind of changing for those. So the village can make decisions. Your first decision is, do we want to opt out of this altogether and say cannabis-related businesses are prohibited within the village? And if we do decide to allow them, it becomes a question of which ones and what kind of regulations are we going to put on them. In the event that you do opt in or allow some or all of these businesses, you can restrict them by zoning district, you can restrict hours of operation, you can regulate their proximity to what the act calls sensitive uses, which isn't defined. You guys kind of get to pick what are the sensitive uses that we're concerned about these being close to, or put some distance limitations on them. Things like school and parks and churches. You can prohibit in residential areas. You can limit the total number of dispensaries in the village, and you can put these distance limitations. The only distance limitation in this particular adult use act is dispensaries themselves have to be 1,500 feet away from each other. Okay. The act further allows the creation of cannabis cafes and lounges in the discretion of the village, and those wouldn't be deemed a public place within the meaning of the Smoke-Free Illinois Act. So, it's a little bit fuzzy, but I think the drafters were envisioning kind of a, you know, if you've ever seen tobacco stores where they allow people to smoke, or hookah lounges where they allow smoke, those are exempted under the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, and so this would be a similar place where people can consume cannabis on site. But you don't have to prohibit that. That's only allowed if you affirmatively say, we want to allow that activity to take place within the community. All right. There's some restrictions on advertising in the act, so you can't advertise cannabis within 1,000 feet of school grounds, playgrounds, hospitals, healthcare, recreation centers, child care centers, parks, libraries, game arcades, etc. And you can't, even within 1,000 feet, do any kind of advertising promoting the overconsumption of cannabis, and display of that displays cannabis, etc. And so there's a whole list of advertising restrictions. And one of the questions that we've had is, does this 1,000 feet mean that the dispensaries themselves can't be within 1,000 feet of any of these? But we really regard a business identification sign. So let's say the place is called Herbal Remedies, right? So that business identification sign can be on a building, so long as there's no other advertising. We don't regard a business identification sign as advertising, but they couldn't have cannabis leaves and other things on the building. And they couldn't have those regardless whether it's 1,000 feet or not, because you can't display cannabis as part of your advertising.
So can they have cannabis, the word cannabis on that sign?
I guess they could, yeah, if it's part of the business name. I think a lot of them are kind of going with more generic names, figuring that they'll be able to get the word out as to where they are. And people come up with all kinds of things, I'm sure, but that's an interesting question. I don't know if I've looked specifically at whether you could have cannabis, but it's not really on the prohibited list, so I think you could, as long as you don't have pictures of it. So the act is 610 pages long. It has a lot of regulations, and that's before the 4 state agencies that are going to oversee this have enacted their rules and regulations. So there's going to be a lot more coming out even. But these are some of the things that are in the act that talk about how dispensaries are to be regulated by the state, and some of the do's and don'ts of having a dispensary. They're only allowed to be open between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. You guys could play, in the event that you did want to allow them, could play around with those hours either through a special use permit where you say, okay, we understand the state allows that, but we don't think at this specific location it's appropriate to be open at 6 a.m., so we're going to make it 9. So you can do things like that, or just generally have some regulations that may control those hours. Unlike some other states, there's no delivery of cannabis in Illinois, where you can have delivery services taking it out to people's door. No drive-through facilities are allowed. There's a lot of requirements regarding security cameras, video surveillance equipment, number of employees on site, and those types of things. And so we have specific provisions in the state law that if your video surveillance equipment goes down, you can't sell, you gotta close. If there's less than 2 people working, you can't sell, you gotta close. If the electronic verification system, there's some kind of verification system tied into the state. If that becomes inoperative, you can't operate, you have to be closed. So the state is trying to, make sure that these places toe the line, and I think they'll be motivated to toe the line as well, because there are there's very high entrance fees to get into this business. You're going to have a lot of funding. The application fees are extremely high, and so it's not just going to be mom and pop operations getting into this. It's well-funded organizations with investors.
And then there's a limited number of licenses that are gonna be issued this
Yep.
first round.
Yes, and I'll get to that.
I'm assuming
Second.
for a first round.
Yes.
They didn't
There's gonna
call
be
it.
multiple rounds.
They-
Just in terms of general public activity, there's not gonna be cannabis allowed in any public place where, or use of cannabis in any public place where a person can reasonably be expected to be observed by others, or in a healthcare facility or any other place where smoking is prohibited. So this really controls outdoors and in public buildings. You're not gonna have people being able to walk down the street and be smoking a joint. They could be subject to, tickets in that case. A private residence is not a public place unless it's used for child care, foster services, or social services. So, if somebody wants to do this within their own home, you can't prevent that. You can't use it while operating a motor vehicle, or while you're under the influence of cannabis, you can't operate a motor vehicle. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. And again, unlike some other states, there's not going to be vending machines. I think some dispensaries in other states have actual vending machines, but that's not going to be allowed here. Taxation and revenue. Why are some municipalities interested in getting into allowing these businesses here? One of the big motivators is the ability to tax them. So in addition to the 10 to 25% taxes that the state is going to impose, most of which goes to the state with the exception of a 8% that's kind of broken up between the different municipalities for crime prevention and law enforcement purposes. There's going to be an ability for a local government that does allow these to impose a 3% tax on the purchase price of cannabis, all of which is going to come directly back to the municipality after it's collected by the Department of Revenue. And that's in addition to any other sales tax that you may have on retail sales, as well as if you have the 1% tax in addition in your business district, that again is on top of that, so you can kind of pile up these taxes. So you don't have to do the full 3%, but it's a not to exceed number. 3% is the max that you can do. Like I mentioned, driving under the influence of cannabis will continue to be illegal. This is one of the tough parts of the act. I'm sure the chief can tell you more about some of the challenges of trying to deal with drug drivers as opposed to drunk drivers, because with drunk drivers we have an actual test we can administer that tells you their blood alcohol level. And there is no such test for cannabis at this time. I have to believe that people are scrambling around to find one because it's going to be very lucrative if somebody comes up with something that is adopted nationwide. But at this point, there is nothing. So we're kind of stuck with our traditional roadside tests of walking the line and touching your nose and all that kind of stuff. But it is still illegal to obviously consume in a vehicle or drive while impaired. Okay, so I mentioned medical cannabis a couple times. So medical cannabis was approved several years ago. The village we made some zoning amendments at that time to say we're only going to allow medical cannabis. And the reason they did this is because you can't prohibit medical cannabis facilities the same way that you can for these recreational. But we could impose reasonable zoning measures, so the village at that time adopted zoning amendments that restricted dispensaries and cultivation centers for medical cannabis to the I-2 zoning district, the industrial district. None have ever located here, but we do have those zoning regulations in place. The Medical Cannabis Act authorized a total of 56 dispensaries and 20 cultivation centers statewide. And so that's kind of where things stand. Those 56 licenses out there. Those existing 56 dispensaries can now add either an adult use component at that location or start a secondary adult use location somewhere else. So they're going to be shopping around for places. So let's say they are in an industrial area now and they realize that they could go to another community for their adult use component and be on like a more main thoroughfare that's easier for people to find and without going through an industrial park or whatever. That may be attracted to them, so they are out looking for these secondary sites that they think would be good places for their recreational dispensaries. And those existing 56 dispensaries are the only ones that are gonna be up and running on January 1st because they're allowed to get these secondary sites. Everybody else who's starting from scratch and doesn't have an existing dispensary is going to be applying early next year to be open at the earliest mid-2020 sometime. And so we're looking at about, as Amy mentioned, about 75 licenses possibly being issued for January 1st operation. But that will be ramping up in 2020 further, and I think there's projections at some point that we may reach much higher numbers, and I'll show a chart in a few minutes as to what some of the, in just a minute, we're almost done, of what some of the other state numbers are. One other thing, so at one point there was the ability in an early draft of this to be able to grow cannabis at your house. In the last final approved version of this, through the actions of the chiefs of police and some other groups, we're able to get that out. So the only people who can do home grow at this point are people with licensed medical marijuana cards, people who are medical marijuana patients and have a card that will allow them to grow up to 5 plants at home. Okay.
Who regulates that? Like, do they go to these houses and make sure that they only have 5 plants? Because they could say, yeah, I have 5 plants, and you go in there for one initial look, and
Right.
next
Yeah,
thing you go,
so it's very difficult to control. I haven't looked at what the regulations are. I think that's controlled by Department of Agriculture, is the enforcement arm for that. And so if a violation came to our attention, for instance, we could bring it to the state's attention to address, or we were talking about the possibility of being able to enact our own local ordinance that would monitor some of that activity. And obviously, you know, if you don't have that card, you're not authorized. It's unlawful possession of marijuana if you're growing at home. So we would still have those kinds of tools at our disposal. But yeah, it's something that's hard to monitor, and I think that's one of the big reasons it was scaled back, is we didn't want widespread, just everybody growing at home. There are some zoning restrictions under the Medical Cannabis Act. Like I said, I was talking before about adult use, but under medical cannabis, cultivation centers can't be within 2,500 feet of certain types of facilities. There's a list there. And when it was originally enacted several years ago, dispensaries had a 1,000-foot location restriction from that list of things. After the General Assembly approved adult use marijuana earlier this year, they then went back with a second bill to address some medical act changes and took out that distance regulation. So now there's no distance regulation for medical dispensaries, just like there's not really one for adult use dispensaries from any of these uses. Now you can put those in if you want. So your zoning code currently says medical dispensaries have to locate whatever the distance limitations are in the Medical Cannabis Act, which aren't there anymore. So if you want to impose some medical act distance restrictions, that's something that we can talk about doing. You do have something in there that says they can't be right next to some different types of uses, but the 1,000 feet, you were just kind of relying on the fact that the state act covered that 1,000 feet. Okay, so I wanted to bring that to your attention, that the distance limitations for medical cannabis are now gone. And lastly, we just wanted to talk, here's some of the places that the existing medical dispensaries are. So you can see down this way, you know, we have Mokina, Joliet, Morris, and then further out, there's, you know, places like Rockford. But these are kind of the ones that are all around the Chicago metropolitan area and the Cowler counties. Just to give you an idea, 13 of those are located within industrial parks, 10 in high-traffic major retail corridors, and a surprising 7 are located adjacent to residential neighborhoods. And lastly, I mentioned, you know, you guys are the 11th state now to legalize adult use. Here's some of the numbers from other places. You can see Colorado and Oregon have a very large number of dispensaries that have been approved relative to their populations. And then other places like Maine and Michigan just aren't ramped up yet because they're more recent states to get into this. So Illinois is looking at up to 75 by January 1st and building up to a possible 500 dispensaries over time. All right, so so that's the overview. Like I said, decision number 1 is does the village feel that they want to allow these businesses within the jurisdiction of the village? If not, we come back with an ordinance that essentially opts out of this the act and the ability of these business establishments to locate here. You can't prohibit the possession and consumption, but you can prohibit the sale of these cultivation and processing activities. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a comment. Talked to a lot of people at the convention about this, and most of the trustees and mayors are pretty conservative people. But the consensus seems to be that if we don't sell it, they'll just go down the street and buy it, and while they're there, they buy the groceries and maybe a car, who knows what else, but you've eliminated. It's kind of like when we used to not sell liquor on Sundays or Sunday mornings, and we changed that because we were chasing people out of town on Sunday mornings. So even though they're not advocates of drug things, talked to the mayor of Rochelle, they're about twice our size, and they projected tax revenue coming to the village about 132 to 135,000. We would be about half that much based on our population. So the consensus pretty much seems to be that it's legal.
Yeah, one of the things that I did in preparation for this is send out to the attorneys within the office, you know, hey, what are all the different municipal clients doing? And compiled those responses. And the numbers I got were, we had 8 that were opting out for sure, 2 that were leaning towards no, 3 that are undecided and haven't taken any action yet, 5 that are leaning towards yes, and a surprising 13 that are approving it or in the process of approving it. So there seems to be more yes than no, although there's certainly, you know, a split and plenty of places saying let's wait and see how it turns out. But the point you raise is one of the motivating factors, especially where these communities are divided only by a street, right? Where they're like, well, if we don't do it here, they're gonna do it across the street. And then we won't be able to do it because of that 1,500-foot radius. And our police department, who we know and trust to enforce these, won't have the control over it that we have if it's across the street in this other jurisdiction. And then there's the tax money question too, that you know, the sums can be significant depending on the amount of sales, especially these early ones where the market's not saturated with dispensaries.
The other thing that you mentioned about the cost of getting into it, and I don't know if these numbers are exact, but things I heard, the application fee is like about $25,000, and then most of the people that are serious about it have to hire some really high-powered attorneys who've been through this before, and you could spend $100,000 to $200,000 because the state weighs there's a score for all these different things that, you know, what are we gonna do for the community and what's the history and on and on. So you could be talking about, and by the time you get a facility up and going, you know, $250,000 or more, you know, and then staffing with 2 people all the time. It's an expensive, major operation, which would lead me to believe that the people that are gonna be in it are gonna be people that are in it and know how it all works. And too much money to be lost not to do it correctly.
No, I just think it's ironic that in January, an illegal drug is gonna become legal, and it's gonna be called recreational, you know, and all these years, people have been going to jail for it, and now it's recreational. I mean, where do you stop? After recreational cannabis, is there gonna be recreational cocaine, recreational heroin, recreation meth? Where does it stop?
Once the state figures out how they can get their cut,
But the state won't. They won't, this is too big of a program for the state to conduct business. Where the money is supposed to go, well, look at the
Look at
Illinois
the
lottery in
toll ways.
1975.
Yes.
All that money was supposed to go to education. None of that money goes to education.
Georgia's the only one that works in.
Mr. Morris,
I hate
did
your
they,
questions.
they indicated how the money's handled? Because the IRS still has some issues on the weed, the cannabis facilities.
Right.
And are they using charge cards? Because I'm not sure the charge card people accept that on their charge card bills.
Right,
Is
there's
that some of the
there's definitely
conditions
some
on the-
challenges, relative to the banking and functionality of this based on the fact that it's still illegal at the federal level. Banks are concerned about dealing with, cannabis businesses because of the threats of the federal government possibly coming down on them if they do. There are some signs that the Trump administration may be softening on that as we get up closer to election time. So we'll have to see how that goes. But right now, it is unknown. I mean, they've been, in Colorado, initially, they were bringing their tax money in pillowcases, It's largely a cash business. You have to have a lot of security and make sure that you are being careful with the money and how it's handled. I don't know how they'll do it from a banking.
Because I thought on this, because there's been so much stuff that is actually more cash money for the people that are purchasing it.
Mhm.
Because the charge card companies don't want nothing to do with that, because they don't wanna fall under the IRS mess stuff. And so you got, how the federal government and the DEA regulates it, it's illegal, and then we have 13 states that have enacted it.
Right.
And then, like I said, reading all your literature, which is very informative, but, I guess I'm and I've said this, Illinois makes any more promises what they're gonna do with tax money. I just wonder how many times they can get away with some of the promises that they never keep. I love the process that infrastructure for schools, that's positive. I mean, they were hitting all the key components. Hey, it's for schools, it's gonna help with facilities for people that have narcotic problems. And they're gonna pay off pension issues. A lot of promises on money, but I hate to say, because we're all residents of Illinois, and what Mr. Parker said, we've heard so many promises what we're gonna do with money.
We haven't seen
It makes it hard to
Yeah.
believe that they're not going to try to find something to generate money, and then where's it gonna be if the schools need to build and all this? I mean, Illinois has a history.
One of the things that I found amusing is they put this 10 to 25% tax on cannabis depending on its strength. And then they give municipalities the ability to do 3%. And then after they initially passed the act and the counties complained that they weren't gonna be cut in, they passed more legislation that said the counties can impose 3% even within incorporated towns. And then the bill sponsors said, hey, municipalities, don't do that whole 3%, don't be greedy. because it might scare, it might price people out of the market. And I just thought that was pretty ridiculous, given all the taxes that they have. So.
Well, and I just happened to do a little more research and seeing that in Colorado, which we hear about Colorado, that the cannabis retail is only 1% of their overall budget, the revenues from in Colorado. I said, what? So you see that, everybody's, and it's, but they are paying for things out there, with as many places they got, they're using the money to generate that, and, I just, whatever the wishes of the board are, I'd have to say I'm a little hesitant to believe everything the state says right now.
Well, I did have a question about dispensaries. Now, dispensaries they can sell cannabis, but you can't smoke it in, like, if it was a bar, if they had like their own bar.
Right, so one of the things that we've seen, you could allow that, but one of the things that a lot of communities are doing initially here is saying, well, we're gonna allow dispensaries, but we're not gonna let people use there. Okay, because we don't want people driving away possibly impaired or whatever else. So we're gonna let you sell, but we have the ability to say you can't use there.
Okay, because the only reason I asked that is because then it said, you can't smoke it in a public place.
Right.
Wouldn't it be a public place?
Well, so there's this exception where if we allow these kind of cafes or on-site consumption, they can be exempted from the smoke-free Illinois Act. Now, one of the things that's happening is when the General Assembly gets to their fall veto session, which is gonna happen in October and November, everybody is expected that there's gonna be some follow-up legislation called the trailer bill, where they kind of correct some of the uncertainties and gray areas and confusing and conflicting points that they have in this 610-page bill that was passed. It kept being amended, and then they passed it. So it's got some problems that they're gonna address. And one of the things that we think may be addressed is that they have gotten a lot of pushback on the fact that it sounds like you could say, hey, go ahead and use in a bar, right? If a municipality wants to let you, and there's a lot of concern about that. So I think they're gonna be addressing some of that kind of stuff.
Okay, good. And the other question I had too, when he said that credit cards, it's mostly a cash business, would that raise our crime rate? Because people might be like, okay, we know that they can only get cash. So, since they have all this cash coming in, don't you think there'd be more of like people coming in to burglarize or?
Well, in other states, it's a unique business because they have a big on security and big on safes. And they also get their own armored car service to come in and pick up things because, they don't want to, or other places that they've been doing similar to, they hire private security to go with the money, to follow the money when they have to take it, wherever they take it to process it, And, I don't know, you take it to a bank because the banks don't want it, so what do you do with all this big cash money business? Of course, you pay everything in cash, but doesn't mean they can't have a cash station inside there to process their credit card to then pay cash for things, if that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, despite all these problems, it has been functioning in other states, so it's not like you can't do it, I just don't know how it's gonna be exactly addressed here.
Chief, let me ask you a question, as far as enforcement goes. There's no tool available to show what percentage a user has in his or her system, like there is a BAC. I mean, the breathalyzer test is pretty well cut and dried, but if you do a field sobriety test on somebody who's high, I mean, how admissible is that in court?
Well, the problem you have with narcotic impaired driving is there is no short test or anything you can do because you're measuring the THC that's in the cannabis, or in this retrospect cannabis.
Right.
So you're measuring that. There's no tool that tells you what it is. You can't, and the problem is, on these impaired driving, the crime lab doesn't even wanna handle those. They don't wanna handle the blood or urine samples, so you have to use third-party testing agencies to get that back to see if the people are impaired. So right now, it's a very difficult process to have drug impaired driving, whatever drugs they're taking. And to add to that, I mean, you have to either you get a blood or urine sample or both, and then you have to process to see, you know, and it takes, you know, like I said, the labs are, because of the problem with this drug impaired driving, it's really, it's hard enough. I mean, with a breathalyzer, they want, you know, when you arrest someone, you actually take blood or urine, you have to submit that, and you can wait 90 days to get the results back because the labs are so overwhelmed, and now you're talking about the drug impaired driving. Yeah, like I said, it's an argumentative point. I mean, it's very difficult, like Mr. Marr said. Some manufacturers are gonna try to come up with a test to,
But it won't be here
determine.
January 1st.
I don't know, but that'll be worth it, you know, somebody's gonna make a lot of money on the testing.
They should make it like the diabetes tester.
Yeah, the blood strip.
Mhm.
Well, they get real bad on you taking blood off someone. They just don't like that blood thing
Your
going in there.
candlestick.
So going back to my original question, if you're doing field sobriety tests on an impaired driver, the top, how much, is that worth anything in court?
It's a weighting factor. I mean, unfortunately with the DUIs and the drug and impaired driving, they have taken the DUI legislation and made it so complicated that it's probably easier to get off a murder than it's easier to get off a DUI than a murder. Because they have so many avenues of arguing that, you know, the DUI enforcement is almost becoming more and more difficult because all it's doing has a tendency is lawyers love the DUIs because it involves so much. There's some loopholes that are there and they bring them up every time, and you can't close every loophole that they want to argue. Whether they argue that the vice is wrong or the officer didn't see him driving long enough, or his vision of him being impaired doesn't meet our definition of it. The trees we kill on a drunk driver, there's people that do a lot more serious crimes that the paperwork doesn't have the amount of forms that they do for DUI.
I just see in January, a lot of these being kicked out of court because there's really no evidence.
Well, no, I mean, and, you know, they've taken, you catch people that are weeding as they drive, and that's a problem we have. When they have the weed in their car, it's no different if they have a bottle of beer and they want to drink and drive, they weed and drive. Of course, we stop them, but see, it's only if we catch them with any cannabis below a certain amount, it's a fine only. They outlawed all that. So you have to write them equivalent of a parking ticket.
But do the judges take that into account? If you smell cannabis smoke, or if they have cannabis in the car, and they don't do well on the field sobriety test, the judges take all that into account for.
We don't see a lot of winning on
Okay.
drug-induced,
Yeah.
alcohol, impaired driving for drugs.
Because even if you smell it in the car,
Smell it in the
not
car, try to
quantitative.
get them to say, hey, like you said, the defense lawyers, there's so many parameters, they're writing books how to get out of DUIs. The national pastime is how complicated you can make it. And the officers are doing everything that their training allows them to do. But now they're teaching us now, okay, now you have to work on people that are drug-induced driving, and you have to make sure you're doing the right field tests. And I'm afraid that DUIs are becoming something that are not going down in our society. it's just not because the complexity of the paperwork. I don't know if that answered your question or
Yeah,
not, but it,
Thanks.
And it's probably an issue you're gonna have whether you opt in or you opt out.
oh, yeah, absolutely. We have that problem today with people that are impaired by some means.
Or is there an issue, do you think there's a connection with opting in and a rise in?
Don't know yet. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, a lot of this is obviously a new frontier, it would be interesting to see
Definitely
how
a
it
new
all shakes out.
frontier as far as a revenue source also. We're not, this is completely new revenue source. It's not like it's a completely new industry also, so you're, I understand you know, you don't agree with the philosophy of the state, but, and what they're gonna do with their money, but just like video gaming, we do see the revenues that come in. Whether you know, so whether they're using the money wisely from their perspective, it is a revenue source at the local level, and they are passing it through our portion.
Well, and that's what my rub
Mhm.
is that, you know, it's dollar run, it's
Mhm.
dollar based, and something that was bad all these years is now, yeah, it's okay, yeah, recreational. I just don't agree with it.
What is the timeline then for a decision to opt in or out? Is it January first?
Yeah, you should really make a decision by January first,
Okay.
in or out, because we don't wanna get in a situation where somebody puts in an application after January first and you haven't taken action, because it might be viewed just as a regular retail use, then they could go anywhere, right?
Right.
Because at its core, it is a retail transaction,
Right.
so we wanna enact whatever you guys want, we wanna get those regulations in place.
Okay, I don't think we're gonna make a decision tonight,
Right.
but where do you see our
We can't.
timeline? Any expectations, like the next month or so, a couple months? Additional meetings?
Yeah, I mean, as many meetings before that time that you guys wanna discuss it. I mean, we gave you a couple sample ordinances here. Michael put a couple that you could, you know, start looking at. One is one that was a prohibition ordinance, and one that was one that allowed it, just so you could kind of get a feel for what they look like, for review. So I know we gave you lots and lots of information, so if you wanna kind of look at those, I mean, we could plan on, the next COW if you wanna talk about it some more
And those are both ordinances, I've worked with both those communities directly on those ordinances.
Okay.
Went through the whole zoning process in Riverside with that one regulation.
I'll give you some more time to digest this, and I know that you sent you guys some information also.
Okay.
I mean, so whatever you wanna do, or we have at least another month. We
Okay.
could have another discussion about it.
Another meeting would be good in that. I guess, looking at the clock here, I was just gonna move on the agenda unless there's any other conversation. Any general discussion outside of these agenda items? If not, take a motion to adjourn.
Motion.
Second.
Motion by trustee Jones and a second by trustee Moravka.
Jones.
Yep.
Maravka? Yes. Ham?
Yes.
Parker?
Yes.
And March?
Yes.